So hello everyone, thanks very much for joining us today. We're doing a very interesting video today actually, Enda Benson here. We're actually contrasting the difference between European Christianity with American Christianity. And this is going into a bit more detail than actually the last video, but in order to do that we'll just take a brief look back at a brief recap on the Reformation itself. In 1517 Martin Luther became disillusioned with the church in terms of a lot of corruption in regard to indulgences, that type of thing, and over the next few years he found himself in serious conflict with the church, and he developed his own basic understanding of Christianity, which revolves around the idea of faith alone. And over the next few years, from 17 to 22, he wrote 3 books actually in 1520. And he developed this idea of faith alone. And in the next couple of years, actually, by the mid-20s, there was a lot of strife. There was a lot of strife in Germany between people who wanted to join the Reformed faith. Some of the clergy did as well, and some of the people who actually wanted to remain Catholic. So, in that atmosphere, he wrote a book in the mid-20s in 1525 called The Bondage of the Will. And actually, what that means is that as far as Martin Luther is concerned, he believes that mankind has absolutely no role whatever in terms of their own salvation, that it's all about the actual work of God. It's nothing to do with mankind having an input. So that's actually where he breaks with basically traditional Catholic theology, in a sense that this book, Bondage of the Will, is actually a break with the old tradition that had lasted 1500 years. So over the following few years, of course, Switzerland 5 years later finds itself in the middle of a civil war because its own national security is actually disrupted. It's put out of balance as a result of there had been various different understandings, military alliances between the various provinces or cantons of Switzerland, but that actually broke down because of the impact of the Reformation. So Switzerland went to war with itself, actually, various different Reformed cantons and actually Catholic cantons. Eventually that was sorted out. Zwingli, another radical reformer, was at the head of the Swiss movement in regard to that. And then, of course, another major theologian, a French theologian by the name of John Calvin. He was actually a teenager when Luther was actually writing the book Bondage of the Will. But Calvin actually developed this idea further, that mankind has no free will. And he developed the doctrine of predestination, which means that God predestines or predetermines whether people are going to actually be condemned or going to be saved. So that's actually the doctrine of total depravity. And these ideas, Luther and Calvin were very similar in relation to the whole concept of total depravity and predestination. But Calvin actually worked out a more detailed system of how that would work in practice. And Calvin died in 1564, but that a few years earlier, another actually great theologian was born. His name was Jacob Arminius. And he was part of the Calvin tradition all through his 20s and 30s, another great theologian, done a doctorate in theology and was in the Netherlands, but he actually began to question some of the strict ideas of Calvinism, and he promoted the idea that actually free will did have a role in salvation. In a sense, in regard to the actual salvation, he was actually saying that we shouldn't completely ignore the Catholic position on this. So there was a big, a big confrontation within the Calvinist movement, and in the aftermath of Arminius' death. He died in actually 1609, and then we had this situation where Calvinism was truly defined along the lines of tulip, which is total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. All of these things are related to the idea that God decides everything, mankind has no input whatever into it. And this package of ideas began to fall apart in the aftermath of 1618, because Arminianism didn't die. It actually took different forms in actually the Netherlands, and it took different forms in different countries in Europe as well. because it was basically a kind of Catholic doctrine operating within the Reformed tradition. And the next significant date, I think, would be in terms of the impact of European Christianity having on American Christianity. The next very significant date would be 1555, because in 1555 there were so many wars, so many conflicts between countries, within countries. For instance, Britain in the 39 period, 1539, came up with the 6 Articles to try and stabilise the country. Henry VIII wasn't really a reformed person. In the early years, he wrote a document in defending the Pope, but he was never really part of the reform movement. The 6 Articles of 69 actually stated very clearly that it was in favour of transubstantiation, in favour of the Mass, in favour of various different Catholic elements like priestly celibacy and all this sort of thing. That's the six Articles. And then there was another significant development in 1555, just about 16 years after the 6 Articles. We have this treaty. There were so many wars that the various different powers of Europe decided that to try to stabilise the actual turmoil that actually had existed for over 20 years at this stage. And what they did was they actually came to an agreement among themselves, the nobility did, that actually the ruler of each territory would decide the religion of that territory. And this was a major, major change in terms of what Martin Luther himself had visualized as a young man when he was writing the original books that outlined his vision of Christianity. Here we have a situation which is complete opposite to that. He wrote a book, of course, inviting the nobles in Germany to come in and reform the church, and other countries in Europe, especially England, took advantage of that because actually there was billions and billions of pounds worth of property at stake, and the nobles took over all that church property, but they didn't do much in terms of reforming the church along the lines that actually Martin Luther wanted. But they actually did manage to increase their own power in regard to actually minimising the role of the papacy, minimising the role of the centre of the empire in Rome. So they actually managed to increase their own wealth, increase their own revenue streams, but at the same time they didn't do a lot in terms of reforming along the lines that actually Martin Luther recommended. And then in the mid-50s, in 1555, this is very significant in that this treaty, the Treaty of Augsburg, actually allowed the actual rulers of Europe to decide what religion the people would have. So from that point onwards, people didn't have much choice, but of course there was minorities within each territory. And this so-called Peace of Augsburg didn't really bring the type of peace that was hoped for, because there was various minorities within various territories, inside France, inside Germany, inside a lot of different countries in Europe, and there was continuous tension, continuous conflict, especially France in the following years in the actual 1562 to 98, and that 36-year period, France went through tremendous internal upheaval because of the conflicts between the Catholic and the Reformed tradition. So it didn't really solve anything, the Peace of Augsburg. So then we'll move on to the next century very quickly, in 1600s, from the 1618 to actually 1648. This what's known as the 30 Years' War, and during that period millions of people died. There was tremendous conflicts within Germany, within France, and between states as well, between Spain and France, between France and various different, and between Spain and the Netherlands. There was a lot of different conflicts which took place. So then in 1648, they came up with the actual Treaty of Westphalia. And that actual peace treaty actually meant that it was basically the idea of coexistence, tolerance. Various different countries had substantial minorities of Catholics, or substantial minorities of actually the Reformed tradition either, and actually it was decided that it was time to coexist. So this was the actual basis of, it was a basis of a more tranquil Europe in the aftermath of the mid-17th century. This peace treaty actually managed to give rights to minorities within various different countries. And this became a significant formula in America then, in that the whole idea of religions coexisting is basically something that the founding fathers of the American Constitution took from this, because they recognized this was the actual best formula in terms of actually any religion operating within a country, that no religion would be totally dominated or recognized by the state, and no religion would be completely sidetracked either. There'd be actually rights for all people of various different religious convictions. And this became an important model in American Christianity. So another important development in terms of American Christianity would be actually that Calvinism at the end of Calvinism at the beginning of the 17th century, around the years 1610 to 1618, there was a split within the Calvinist movement. Arminians began to press the idea that free will had a role, and that it had a role in actually salvation. And this became a significant movement in America in later years, because in the first centuries, before actually American independence was achieved in 1776, before the Declaration was declared, the American colonies existed there for a couple of hundred years. And Calvinism was was the dominant religion for the first few decades, especially in the 17th and 18th centuries. But as the new generations of people came across from Europe, Calvinism tended to decline, because various other voices, Methodists, Anglicans, Catholics, etc., came into America. And in this situation, in the revivalist movement of the 18th century, the 1730s and 1740s, great preachers like Jonathan Edwards and people like this, began to actually call people forward at their great revivalist meetings, and there was altar calls. And of course, this was actually contrary to the whole concept of Calvinism in its strict sense, in the sense of predestination. If everything was decided in advance and there was the elect on one side and the condemned on the other side, if that was true, the whole idea of the revivalist movement wouldn't actually make much sense. But actually in that scenario, the concept of free will within America actually, and personal ambition and personal decision determining people's lives, that became actually the more dominant force. So Arminianism actually became a dominant force through various different actual groups, like for instance the Methodists, the actual Baptist groups, and other Christian groups as well. There was various different aspects of Arminianism in those various different groups, and that created the diverse, energetic nature of American actual Christianity. As we move forward then with the development of radio, the development of television, and more recently online, this whole idea of diversification and division was somewhat accelerated by another great doctrine of the Reformed religion, and that's the actual doctrine of Scripture alone. Because Martin Luther actually, back in the early 1500s, at the Diet of Worms, he actually in 1521, he stood on the principle that there was no authority higher than Scripture. He'd be said by nothing other than his own conscience, his own sense of reason and Scripture, that he was going to ignore church tradition and all that. And of course, that sort of doctrine sounded great at that time, but actually he fell out with another great theologian, actually, Zwingli, in 1529, which I actually go into, and I won't go into that in detail here. But this doctrine of Scripture alone became very strong in America, and this, of course, caused a lot of energy and a lot of diversification, but also a lot of division. So I intend to actually, hopefully, go into a bit more detail on that in modern Christianity in America. But I'm trying here today to give some background of the European foundation, which is built on conflict, built on wars, built on all sorts of intolerance and battles, etc. And the nobility, of course, took advantage of the Reformation movement in the sense that they recognized that in the actual middle of all the chaos, they were able to move in and take over billions of pounds worth of actually church land and church property, and increase their own power, their own revenue, and their own wealth. So actually, that is actually something that I'll hope to deal with next week. A further development on the way that American and European Christianity differ. And I hope this clarified, this particular video today clarified some points for some people. But feel free to actually comment on this video as well if you have additional information to add, or if you have disagreements or whatever. So thank you very much for watching today, and goodbye for now.